Welcome everyone. Good evening or good afternoon, depending on what part of the country you are in, and welcome to the Math Advocacy Institute on FAA reauthorization and improving air travel. Next slide. Just an overview of our agenda. We'll do introductions of our panelists and go over some housekeeping items. I will give you a brief overview of where we are in terms of acceptable air travel and the current bills in Congress that are aimed at addressing the issue of accessible air travel. We'll also have updates on allowing people to stay in their wheelchairs when they fly, proposals for an air travel center of excellence, improved training for airline personnel. We'll also go over how you can get involved and contact your member of Congress, and then we'll have some time at the end for Q&A. Next slide. Brief housekeeping item on the bottom left-hand corner of the screen. You'll see a little button for closed captioning for those who are deaf and or hard of hearing like myself. And then on the right-hand side of your screen at the bottom, you'll see a little dialogue bubble with an arrow next to it. Click on that and you can put questions in the Q&A box. Next slide, please. So again, I am Michael Lewis. I am the Director of Disability Policy here at MDA. Tonight I am privileged to be joined by two experts in accessible air travel, Heather Andley, who is the Associate Director of Government Relations for the Paralyzed Veterans of America. Her responsibilities include managing PVA's efforts on Capitol Hill and working with the administration to promote legislation and policies that ensure veterans with significant disabilities receive the healthcare and benefits they have earned and the civil rights protections that they deserve. He also works to promote collaboration between disability organizations and veteran services organizations under the past chair of the Consortium for Constituents with Disabilities, which is the largest coalition of national organizations working together to advocate for people with disabilities at the federal level. MDA is also a member of CCD. We also have Michelle Irwin, who was president and founder of All Wheels Up. Her interest in accessible air travel began in 2011 when it became clear that traveling with or as a person who has a severe physical disability and uses a wheelchair was not safe. Today, Michelle works to further accessible air travel through research and advocacy related initiatives. All Wheels Up is the only nonprofit organization in the world funding the research necessary of wheelchairs and wheelchair securement systems for in-cabin use. In 2019, they testified before the U.S. House Transportation Committee on Accessible Air Travel, Wagner Airlines, and in front of the Access Board. Today, All Wheels Up is considered a leader in accessible air travel research and is now consulting, mentoring, or acting as a professor of practice on multiple projects for a wheelchair spot on airplanes. Next slide, please. So just a little bit of an overview of where we are. As we all know, air travel accessibility is a big problem for people with neuromuscular diseases and other disabilities. Back in 1986, Congress enacted the Air Carrier Access Act, was directed the Department of Transportation to promulgate accessibility regulations for airlines. However, unlike most other methods of transportation, the airlines are not covered under the 1990 Americans with Disabilities Act. However, there has been several updates to accessibility regulations. The first of which were promulgated in 1990. The latest regulation was an airline passenger with disabilities Bill of Rights that was released by the Department of Transportation last July on the 32nd anniversary of the ADA. Among other things, this guarantees the right of people with disabilities to travel and be treated with dignity and respect, to receive information about services and aircraft capabilities, the right to receive info in accessible format, the right to accessible airports, and so much more. Next. This year, the Federal Aviation Act, which governs all air travel, must be reauthorized by September 30th. If it's not passed by then, nobody can fly. So it really presents a terrific opportunity to enact much needed improvements that will make air travel more accessible for people with disabilities, such as securing a wheelchair spot on airplanes, improving enforcement mechanisms against the airlines for violations of the rights of passengers with disabilities, and so much more. Next slide. First up, we have Heather Endley, as I said, she's the Associate Executive Director of Government Relations for Paralyzed Veterans of America, and MDA has been honored to work with her for several years now on this issue, and Heather is going to tell us about multiple bills that have been introduced so far this year to improve accessible air travel. Heather?
Well, thank you, Michael, for that introduction, and I appreciate the opportunity to be with you all here today. Next slide, please. So as we dive in to the legislation that we're hoping will get added to the FAA bill that Michael spoke about, we just wanted to start off with a survey that many of us helped to do for the 35th anniversary of the Air Carrier Access Act, which just to help us to have some data to support all of those anecdotal stories that we hear about and issues I know from PVA members, and I'm sure from folks in this community. So our survey was conducted October 4th through December 6th of 2021. And we had over 1,200 individuals that responded. And we covered a wide variety of issues that passengers with disabilities face, from people who are traveling with service animals, to people flying with wheelchairs, people who are deaf or hard of hearing or blind, people with cognitive impairments, just to try to learn more about, from a kind of a survey numbers perspective, what the experience was. Next slide, please. So, although many respondents in our survey said they do travel by air, we asked them to pick from a list of reasons that maybe would keep them from flying, if they could avoid it. And the ones that we have on the slide here are, one is, concerns that people had about personal safety in transferring from the wheelchair to the aisle chair to the aircraft seat. Almost 55% said that was a reason they might choose not to fly. Being unable to use the lavatory. As you probably know, if you're on an airplane that just has one aisle on it, there are very rarely an accessible lavatory for somebody who uses a wheelchair or maybe needs help in the lavatory from a caregiver. So 64%, almost 65% said that might keep them from traveling by air. And then damage to the wheelchair. Almost 75% said that was reason enough that they may decide to drive or to take a train or some other mode of transportation. And later on in the survey, I'm not going to go into it, but the reasons that people were afraid of the wheelchair damage was because about the same percentage, 75%, said they had damage to their wheelchair. So it was a well-founded fear. Next slide, please. What's important to note is that many in the survey, over 75% of those who responded said that they would fly at least a few times a year if the experience was safe and dignified, not just when they have to fly because they don't have another choice. So it's really, we make this point because it's not just that people with disabilities, of course, should have access to air travel as a matter of equity and as a civil right. But it's also lost revenue for the airlines if people with disabilities are choosing to drive instead of fly. And we want people with disabilities to be able to benefit from air travel just like everyone else does. Next slide, please. So unfortunately, Michael mentioned we have the Air Carrier Access Act, which is like the ADA for air travel. And the problem is that there are very few accessibility requirements. The Air Carrier Access Act doesn't doesn't require the kind of accessibility that you find on buses and trains and subways under the Americans with Disabilities Act. There's also no private right of action, which means there's nothing in the law that says you can go to court and say to an airline, you violated my Air Carrier Access Act rights. So it makes it really hard to get justice whenever there's a problem, because you can file a complaint with the airline, you can file a complaint with the Department of Transportation, but the DOT complaints are administrative processes. They're not going to be able to give you any money or compensation if they find that your rights were violated. It's a very unsatisfactory process. So we believe that to really improve the process of the opportunities for people with disabilities in air travel, we need to improve the process, which means we've got to amend the Air Carrier Access Act to make it better. And so that's next slide, please. Legislation that we've been working on. So the Air Carrier Access Amendments Act, it's the ACAAA. It's been introduced in the House and the Senate. So in the House, it's HR 1267, and in the Senate, it's S545. And the House bill is led by Nevada Representative Dina Titus, and it currently has 20 other members of the House that have signed on as a co-sponsor. The Senate bill is led by Wisconsin Senator Tammy Baldwin, and it currently has 8 co-sponsors, including Senator Tammy Duckworth, who uses a wheelchair herself due to disabilities that she acquired as a result of her military service. So you might ask, okay, that's great. What does this law do? Well, what it would do in its simplest form is it would require standards of access for aircraft, and it would improve the enforcement of the law. So specifically what it would do is it would require the Secretary of Transportation to assess what we call civil penalties, so basically fines, for violations. So if they determine your rights were violated, there were in certain situations, like if they break your wheelchair, you get injured, you get denied boarding unjustly, then they would fine the airline for having done this because they have violated the law. And then they would refer patterns of discrimination to the Department of Justice for further action. So sometimes you may see under the Americans with Disabilities Act that the Department of Justice has, they've sued, Amtrak, train service, or Greyhound bus service, and they would be able to do stuff like that. But this time for airlines. The law would also grant individuals with disabilities the right to go to court and pursue their rights under the Air Carrier Access Act, just like you can under the Americans with Disabilities Act. That's enforcement. In terms of standards, it would require the Secretary of Transportation to work with another federal agency called the U.S. Access Board to formulate disability access standards. Some of those would include a path of travel to bring a wheelchair onto a plane and either be able to transfer from your wheelchair into the passenger seat so you could avoid the aisle chair that currently many people have to use if you use a wheelchair to be able to get on the aircraft. And then if it's deemed technologically feasible, then the standard could also allow for a person to wheel on onto the aircraft and stay and fly from their wheelchair. For those wheelchairs that get put down below, it would require planes, the cargo area, to be designed to receive those wheelchairs and to make sure that they can fit and hopefully not be damaged the way that they are today, but also hopefully increase opportunities in the cabin for stowage of particularly manual wheelchairs, where individuals may want to transfer into a passenger seat for the flight. And then after those standards are done, there would be a 5-year time period where airlines would know, okay, this is coming. And then after that 5-year time period, the aircraft they use would have to meet those standards. It would also ensure that any areas in the airport that are owned or operated by the airline would have to be accessible. Airports in general are under the Americans with Disabilities Act. But if it's an area that's owned or controlled by the airline, then it's under the Air Carrier Access Act. So it can get a little sticky. But like I said, the important point to remember is we need standards that recognize that airplanes are not accessible to pretty much all people with disabilities, and that we would also have opportunities for better enforcement of the law as it currently exists, and also the changes that would be put into place. Next slide. So the way that this legislation would move, would potentially pass Congress and become a law, is that it would go into the FAA reauthorization. And as Michael mentioned, The current FAA authorization expires this year on September 30th. And so Congress either has to extend the current authorization or they have to pass a new one. And so one of those two things has to happen by the end of September. And so the reauthorization vehicle is seen as what we call a vehicle. It's something that's got to move. And so you want to get the language from your bill into that bill, because that bill, you know, is going to have to find its way to the president's desk. Next slide, please. So some of the ideas for the next FAA reauthorization include things like amending the Air Carrier Access Act with the ACAAA that we just discussed. We also want to make sure that we reauthorize the current advisory committee that exists to advise the Department of Transportation about the needs of people with disabilities in air travel. There's proposals to require DOT to continue research into flying in your wheelchair and to better analyze the data that the airlines provide every month about the wheelchairs and scooters that they lose or that they damage or delay, so that they can better understand what types of devices are what they call mishandled, and are there root causes that they can better determine because they're taking the data and looking at it a little more closely. There are also proposals that would require airlines to provide wheelchair users with more information about the cargo hold size. So how big is the cargo hold that your wheelchair is going to have to go through to get into the belly of the aircraft? Is it big enough? And then access to alternative flights if that's needed. You know, if, for instance, that your wheelchair won't fit on a particular aircraft because the aircraft cargo is too small, requirement for them to either put you on another plane that they have another flight at no cost to you, or that of another airline. Improving access to seating accommodations. So if you need to be in a different part of the aircraft than what your ticket is for, because you need that due to a disability, having access to that without additional cost for you and somebody who's traveling with you. And then also to consider the needs of people with disabilities in evacuations. Right now, when the tests that they've done to see can they get everybody off of an airplane as fast as they need to if there were to be an accident, don't include people with disabilities. So they don't really know if people with disabilities could be evacuated as quickly as people would need to be evacuated. They also don't include children or older people. So we feel like all of these types of people fly, and therefore they should keep that in mind when they're looking at evacuations. And many of these provisions are in bills that have not been introduced yet. So the best I can say is stay tuned. Senator Duckworth is looking at a lot of these provisions, but those are just in general what some of them are. Next slide, please. So the next steps on the reauthorization, right now the committees, so the House Transportation Committee and then the Senate Commerce Science Transportation Committee are both holding a lot of hearings right now on the FAA reauthorization. And a week ago Thursday, they each held a hearing on the consumer experience. And my organization was able to testify at both of those hearings. I testified at the one on the Senate side. My colleague testified at the one on the House side. And I've got the links here in the slides. If you want to go back and look at the testimony, if you're having trouble sleeping tonight, you want to watch it, you can give a click on that and see what we had to say and some of the questions we got from the members of Congress. It does appear that there is a lot of interest in including provisions related to passengers with disabilities in the next FAA bill. The real question is going to be what? What are they going to include? And is it going to be something that we feel like is really meaningful for people with disabilities? And Michael's going to talk a little bit later about where we need your help. So with that, I'm going to turn it back to Michael to take us to our next presenter.
Thank you so much for that, Heather. Now we have Mr. Irwin, she's the founder and president of All Wheels Up, and she will tell us about some of the proposals that they have offered to the respective committees in Congress for the FAA reauthorization. Hello? Sorry. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Michael, for the introduction, as well as the invite to join everyone here on this webinar. And thank you to everybody at the MDA team. So thank you very much. Next slide, please. So All Wheels Up is a nonprofit. We fund research for accessible air travel. Our mission is to increase awareness for safer and more dignified accessible air travel through research and advocacy. Next slide, please. So before we dive into the work that we are currently doing, I did want to just provide a little bit of history of who we are and the journey that we have taken as a grassroots nonprofit. So we are just over 10 years old. We started because I am a parent of a child who uses a wheelchair, and I learned really early on that it was really difficult to travel with someone who uses a wheelchair. And it dawned on me, how is my child going to go off to college or have a career and be able to travel on his own? And then it further dawned on me, well, how are people doing it today? And I really wanted to see what we could do to change the future of accessible air travel. I do want to let everybody know that we are all volunteer, and we have an incredible board that a working board specifically that supports all of our initiatives. So it took a very long time just to come up with the funding to do the initial crash tests for a proof of concept, which was a wheelchair spot on airplanes. But we were able to conduct that test in 2016, and then subsequently bring it to Congress in 2017, which then spurred the 2018 FAA Reauthorization Act to have the feasibility study for a wheelchair spot on airplanes. And our organization doesn't blame or shame, the industry for where we are today. We recognize that, we just need to move forward with, the research moving forward. But what's happening is showing the industry that we're willing to fund some of the research and bring them along the journey with us has really made the progress more collaborative. In 2020, when the world changed a little bit, we had a pivot and we worked on our Fly Safe Today program, where we're now working directly with the community and engaging with individuals one-on-one and making sure that they can fly safe, and how that you should advocate at the airports and booking your travel. We also now have National Accessible Air Travel Day that launched in 2022, and we're really looking to make that a bigger event nationally and really have that recognized with events and things like that. Next slide, please. So All Wheels Up still funds accessible research. So yes, we did the first proof of concept. We've crash tested multiple wheelchairs and securement systems, but just as a cure-based nonprofit funds that proof of concept, and then we see pharmaceutical companies come in and take on the larger project. That's what we're seeing here with aviation. So we spearheaded the first initial research. We proved it was possible, and now we're starting to see airframers and OEMs starting to invest in what a wheelchair spot could look like. But we know that there's more to be done, so we are funding a roadmap. So how do we get from here today with no standards to certification and implementation? We did provide a small budget impact model, which showed a cost savings to the airlines. And we'll talk about this later. Again, this is sort of rolling into similar to what we did for the 2018 FAA Reauthorization Act. We funded a smaller study, and we're going to look to Congress to fund a larger study. And this year, we are going to expand upon the crash testing that we've done, and we're going to look at floor loads and some injury criteria testing later this year, which we're really excited about. We also now are supporting and funding medical papers. So, for example, we just funded a paper with Duke University and why doctors are supporting a wheelchair spot on airplanes. And that will be published later this year in the Aerospace Medical Association's medical journal. And then we have other projects happening later this year and into 2024, such as pressure mapping. Next slide, please. And All Wheels Up is collaboratively working with the ACAA committees, so working with the MDA and Heather Ainsley on, at the PBA on this global awareness for, the ACAA and the 2023 FAA Reauthorization Act. And so we are honored to work alongside with these great advocacy groups who are pushing forward legislation. Next slide, please. So what All Wheels Up has requested as a proposal for the FAA Reauthorization Act, first is a Center of Excellence for Accessible Air Travel. This would provide a 10-year sustainable source of funding for universities to take that deeper look into accessible air travel research. And it is labeled accessible air travel, while our focus here at All Wheels Up sometimes primarily looks like a wheelchair spot on airplanes. We want to make sure that no matter what the universities want to research, whether it be neurodiversity in air travel or hard of hearing or deaf and blindness research, whether it's for evacuations or other, there's the funding for this sort of research. We have this proposed with Senator Duckworth's office, and we have been working for a few weeks to get that momentum behind it, and we're really hoping to see a standalone bill here. We, just like what Heather Ainsley had discussed, supporting evacuations, we did work on the EVAC Act with Senator Duckworth's office, and right now there is no standard for people with disabilities and evacuations, but we also know that if we are going to go to a wheelchair spot on airplanes, an evacuation standard needs to be submitted with the certification. So we need to make sure that there is an evacuation process to make sure that that is not something that holds up the future of true accessible air travel, which would include a wheelchair spot on airplanes. All Wheels Up also has asked for improved training for all wheelchair pushers and agents. And the lens that we're taking this through is we would like to see that those employees be certified and certified through an accredited organization, specifically through the lens of occupational therapy. So people who are the wheelchair pushers, this is the only industry that touches and lifts people with disabilities that aren't certified. So for example, anybody else who is lifting someone with a disability, whether it's a rehab center or a school setting or any other setting, they are certified. And this is the one area that they are not. So we have asked for this to be looked at congressionally as well as through the executive level. And there is a lot of interest in seeing what this looks like. The training would look similar to, say, the Red Cross CPR. So no matter where you are in the country or even in the world, whether it's being taught or administered, it is exactly the same. And that's what we're requesting. And another caveat onto training, to give these wheelchair pushers and the staff levels of employment, additional growth, we can also request lift teams. And so they might have a little bit more training as they move through their careers. And the next thing that we asked for was a study of economic impact. And this goes back to what I talked about earlier, where All Wheels Up funded a smaller study on economic impact, and we showed cost savings. But the airline said, great job, we'd like to see more. And so an economic impact study to the level that they're looking for would need to come from congressional funding. So similar to what we saw with the TRB study, through the National Associations of Sciences. We're looking for the same thing, but bring to the table the economic experts and analyze that data. And so we're really proud to say that we're now seeing this in Senator Duckworth's Mobile Act, and we're hopefully going to see that roll into the FAA Reauthorization Act and give us some more data to prove that a wheelchair spot can be economically feasible. And next slide. Oh, I think we're done. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Michelle. That was great information, and we very much appreciate all the wonderful work that our staff has been doing, and we've been happy to be part of your working group in the past. Now we're gonna talk about a couple of proposals that MDA has made to lawmakers, excuse me, as they craft the outlines of the bill to reauthorize the Federal Aviation Act. Number one, we would like the DOT to be required to issue a regulation requiring hands-on training baggage handlers that load and stow wheelchairs and mobility devices. Currently, there is no uniform training requirement whatsoever. As you probably all know, a lot of wheelchairs get damaged simply because baggage handlers do not know how to properly load and stow them. They don't know how to disengage the drive belt, so on and so forth. And also we want to require the Secretary of Transportation to report to Congress on enforcement actions against the airlines for damaged wheelchairs and other mobility devices. Currently that's not required. Back in October, there was a Washington Post article that said that since the DOT required airlines to begin reporting the number of damaged, broken, or lost wheelchairs back in 2018, over 24,000 wheelchairs have been broken, damaged, or lost. And this, of course, is costing airlines a lot of money and repairs, replacements, so on and so forth. And so, in addition to increasing enforcement mechanisms, being able to learn about how those enforcement mechanisms are applied, when they are applied, and when they're not, why not? Next slide. Now we're gonna turn it over to my colleague, Mark Fitzy, Director of Grassroots Engagement, who will tell you how you can get involved.
Thank you, Michael. I
Mark.
appreciate it. And I'm seeing lots of great activity going on in the chat box and in the Q&A box. So I see a few questions on international travel, which I'm sure our panelists will be able to answer when we get to the end. But in saying that, if you have any questions, we are going to have ample time to answer them. So feel free to put them in the Q&A box. Feel free to put them in the chat box. We'll be answering them pretty soon. So if you have any questions, feel free to put those in the boxes now. So Michael's right. The time to act is now. So I know I see so many familiar faces and so many that are on the participants, but also lots of new faces. So we've been working up to this moment for a while. So we've been working up to FAA reauthorization for many years now. This is kind of the time where everything we've been trying to do over the last couple of years is coming to a head. So if you contacted your member of Congress before, if you maybe came to a virtual event, a virtual Hill Day we had, it all worked up to this moment where we're going to hopefully get some major reforms passed through this must-pass bill, which is FAA reauthorization. So we really need your help. We really need to make sure that your members of Congress know this is important to you and important to you right now because decisions are being made right now. As Heather said, there's already been some hearings on this. We know that they're working on FAA reauthorization as we speak. So we want to make sure they hear from us before they make those final decision about what gets in the bill. And hopefully a lot of the things that all three panelists talked about will get in that bill. But to make that happen, we need to make sure that your members of Congress hear from you, and they need to hear from you now. So I'll say this many times, if you contact your member of Congress before, you can contact them again. They need to keep hearing from you, and you can go to mda.org/air-travel, mda.org/air travel, and I'll put a link in the chat to do that to make your voice heard during FAA reauthorization. So this is really a group effort, as you can tell. We had Heather from PBA, we had Michelle from All Wheels Up, but a lot of groups are working together on this. And I was writing a few down. We know that folks like from the United Spinal Association, the Christopher Reeve Foundation, Cure SMA, National MS Society, and I know leaving off a lot more. This is truly a group effort from anyone who's affected by air travel. So we're all working together to get these priorities through, but we definitely need your help to do that. So again, you can go to our website, go to mda.org/air travel. Michael, thank you very much for putting that into the chat box. I really appreciate that. And you can just fill out a simple form. It will connect you to who your lawmakers are. So if you're not sure, that's okay. And then you can send a letter to them or encourage them to make air travel accessible during FAA reauthorization. We definitely have a sample form letter you can use, but if you also can customize it yourself. So maybe you've had an experience that you want to share with your member that you've had during air travel, put that in the letter. It will make your voice that much powerful. So again, mda.org /air travel. It's all building up to this year. So if you message your members before, message them again. You can keep doing it until we get the reforms that we need going on. So with that, we will move. We have about 15 minutes for questions, so quite a bit of questions to come in. So get your questions ready. But before we do, you can always visit our website at mda.org/advocacy. I see lots of new faces here, which I'm very excited about. So if you're new to us, please join our grassroots network. You can do that at mda.org/advocacy. You can also text us at MDA-USA to 50457. And you can email us at advocacy@mdausa.org. I'll keep the screen up so you can see it. If you email us there, you're literally emailing me. So feel free to contact with that. So with that, I guess I'll invite Michael back up here and see if we have any questions. I know that might have been answered in the chat a few times, but I do wonder, Michael, if we start with some of the questions about international travel. What do you think about that?
Yeah, I know Heather just responded to one asking if the ACAA applied to foreign airlines. Heather, my understanding was that if they have flights originating from or flying into the United States that it did apply. Is that not correct?
Thanks, Michael. This is Heather. So yes, so It depends. So you have to look at, is it a domestic airline, like a U.S. airline, or is it a non-U.S. airline, a foreign air carrier? So if you're a U.S. carrier, it's complicated because if you buy a ticket, and this is from the regulations, if you're going overseas and at some point you're not at your final destination, but you change to a foreign carrier, and in, let's say Germany to continue on, the foreign carrier is not subject to the Air Carrier Access Act, but the U.S. air carrier is responsible to ensure that compliance happened if the flight number didn't change and they were under the U.S. carrier's code. So if you're on a U.S. carrier like American, Delta, United, any of those, there may be different rules. But if you're on a foreign carrier and you fly out in New York to London, covered. But if you then go from London to Paris on a different a foreign carrier, that's not covered. However, there are other countries have other laws. So you may not be covered under the Air Carrier Access Act, but you may be covered under the European Union rules or the UK rules. So just because air carrier doesn't apply to those segments doesn't mean there might not be other things that those airlines aren't required to do in their countries.
Thank you, Heather.
Thank you, Heather. Let's look at the chat here.
We had a really interesting question from Crystal that came in quite early, so I don't want to miss it. And thank you, Crystal. It was about, I think, the makeup of the ACA Advisory Committee. She wanted to know about people who are living with a disability. Is there a requirement that they are on that board? Is there a number? I know, Heather, you might be able to speak about just kind of the makeup of that committee.
So yeah, happy to speak about that. There are requirements that people with disabilities and also groups that represent them and veterans groups be a part of that advisory committee. So there are currently no members on the committee because the appointments expired, but there were people who use wheelchairs, people with service animals, people who are blind, people who are deaf, that were members of the committee, as well as organizations that worked with, that represent and advocate with individuals from a variety of folks on the disability community. And so they made the committee was pretty big, much bigger than the standard passenger committee, because they did want to include not just people with disabilities, but also people with a variety of disabilities, so that it wasn't all just focused on wheelchair users or, people from a particular community. So the short answer is yes, there were definitely people. In fact, the chair of the committee was a power wheelchair user.
Other questions?
Thank you for that. Yeah, and I know that one thing that we will talk a lot about is pre-boarding for people who need to use wheelchair. We had an interesting question from Barry, who talked about, what about reversing that to the end of the boarding process? But I have a feeling there's a reason we do that at the beginning, right, Heather or Michael?
So there is a requirement for pre-boarding under the law. And many times it is to ensure that people have the ability to do that with dignity, to board the aircraft without having people, right there watching the whole process. That also can mean we've had a lot of complaints from members recently that they're being boarded in the middle of boarding. Because maybe the crew is not there to do the lift. And so they want to get the plane up in the air. And so they'll send people down, they'll board half the airplane, and then they want to do the transfer. So that's typically why, but you can be boarded, at any time. Certainly I've been with colleagues. I don't personally use a wheelchair. I've traveled with colleagues. I work for Paralyzed Veterans of America, so a lot of my colleagues do, and they have boarded at the end. But most of our members very much prefer to do it at the beginning of the flight.
The question from Sally Johnson as to whether Secretary Buttigieg seems to be supportive of these efforts. Absolutely. Secretary Buttigieg has been terrific on these issues. He held and spoke at a public hearing about a year ago, little over a year ago, on the challenges of accessible air travel. He unveiled the Airline Passengers with Disability Bill of Rights this past July, and the DOT is currently working on a few regulations pertaining to accessible lavatories on single-aisle aircraft, accessible in-flight entertainment options, and he is also committed, he has said, to getting a wheelchair spot on an airplane. Heather, I don't know if you and Michelle want to add anything. I'm sure you've had communications with the secretary.
So yeah, no, Michael, I think you characterized the support very well from DOT. Certainly, Secretary Buttigieg has made comments about moving toward flying in your wheelchair. That was pretty amazing coming from the DOT secretary to have that statement, and has moved forward with rules that, like you said, the accessible lavatory rule that should be coming out hopefully within the next couple of months. There's also going to be a rule coming out later this year about the experience of wheelchair users specifically, requiring hands-on training, requiring making it very clear that if an airline breaks your wheelchair, they're responsible for it. Right now, there's some wiggle room in the regulations, so they want to tighten that. So there is more coming this year. So while the Congress is doing a lot, potentially through FAA, the Department of Transportation is also going to be moving forward with some stuff. So there's a lot happening right now.
Yeah, just to echo what Heather was saying, Secretary Pete Buttigieg has publicly, announced his support for a wheelchair spot on airplanes. I think the first time was at the this year's ADA celebration, and then he also made a pretty bold and public statement on the Vice News interview that he did about a month or two ago. So he definitely is a strong supporter for accessible air travel.
We got another question from Shelley, and I'll pose this. Michael, I'll pose this because Shelley emailed me this one personally, so I know what she's coming from here. So, Shelley asks about when we talk about hopefully in the future securing wheelchairs in planes. Has there been any talk about making sure the wheelchairs is there any talk about making sure those wheelchairs are in good condition to begin with? I don't know if that's in any discussion, any of the studies that have been done. I mean, obviously, if someone's power wheelchair is not in good condition, it might not be safe to secure. So I'm not sure if that's something that's been talked about or something we need to think about moving forward as we hopefully attain this goal.
Yeah, it's absolutely been something that has been brought up in some RESNA meetings as well as other meetings. So right now, a wheelchair would have to be a WC19 certified wheelchair. So that is pretty specific in regards to what standard it needs to meet. And then, there has been conversations with the FDA in regards to would it have to go through, a yearly check with your DME and get, basically like a stamp of approval. This is all still conversation, but it is absolutely something that has been discussed and something to absolutely continue to monitor going forward as we work through it.
Thanks, Michelle. Crystal writes in the chat box, can we try to put up the date for the accessible laboratory requirement? We all put very hard to make that very clear during the public comment period the past summer on that rule. The issue being is that the notice to proposed rulemaking would implement the rule for aircraft ordered 18 years after the date of the final rule or delivered 20 years after the date of the final rule, which is really ridiculous, timeline, especially when you consider that rulemaking process actually began during the Obama administration. It was shelved during the Trump administration, and then the current Biden administration actually went through and picked up with it like that. So the airlines really have known that this was coming for the past 6-7 years, and so when MDA submitted their regulatory comments on the proposed rule, we brought that up and said, this has been a multi-year process, and the previous several years should be included as part of that timeline to shorten the timeline under which this requirement will go into effect. Heather and Michelle, anything to add to that?
This is Heather. No, Michael, I think you characterized it well. The airlines really pushed hard to delay it as long as possible. And we asked DOT in our comments as a matter of equity to cut off at least the 6 years we've been waiting. And, we're hopeful that maybe the DOT will be even more focused on doing it quickly. We'll know that once the final rule comes out. I will also say that people in the intervening years have started inventing lavatories that actually do meet the requirements of the law. I've been in one. It's almost in the final certification process stage, and it allowed us, one of our members, her husband, who's her caregiver, and the aisle chair to be in the lavatory with the door closed. And it pops out and pops back in the expanded area, so it doesn't require loss of seats. So we're not, which is why the airlines push so hard to avoid it, because lost seats means lost money. So we're hopeful that DOT will have a better rule for us, do it more quickly, and that if there are products available, that airlines will go on and start buying them, and we will begin to see that that more quickly, because it is a very long time.
Bryce Young suggests that people who use wheelchair be the first ones off the plane, so that everybody has to wait for the wheelchair to arrive when they got to the destination. He said that would probably motivate people to demand that delivery be much more prompt, and I have to agree with you, guys. I think that would be a great way to get the public engaged on the issue and make some change really, really quickly. I have a question. Well, thank you guys so much to Heather and Michelle for joining us tonight. We very much appreciate it, and thank you to everyone else who joined us tonight. Have a great evening, everyone.